An Elf Tale. Alex had been to her mother's friend's house plenty of times and never thought of it as the kind of place where anything strange could happen. It was a normal one-story home with a neat yard and a garage, and it belonged to a woman Alex had always called her aunt because she felt like family. Even later, when she tried to look back and find earlier warning signs, she couldn't. Nothing about the house had ever stood out to her as frightening or disturbing. The day it all happened was the day her aunt was packing up to leave. Alex knew there had been problems between her aunt and her husband for a while, and even without understanding the full details, she could feel the tension in the house. She didn't remember every part of the moving, just certain moments that stayed sharp. At one point, her mother and aunt asked her to help by grabbing blankets from a spare bedroom toward the front of the house. To get there, Alex had to pass through a short hallway that doubled as a laundry space. The washer and dryer were tucked into a closet along the hall, and above them was the attic opening. And it wasn't a pull-down ladder or a proper attic door. It was a square cutout in the ceiling with a flat board laid over it, the kind of thing an adult could handle but a child couldn't. Alex remembered that board clearly because she was too small to reach it. Even if she climbed up on the washer and stretched, she couldn't have moved it. As she walked past the laundry area, she noticed the closet doors were open. That alone was enough to make her look up, and then she saw the board wasn't sitting flat the way it normally did. It had been shifted, leaving the attic partly exposed, and there was light coming from inside, as if someone had turned it on. Alex hadn't heard anyone moving a ladder or dragging anything around, and she was sure neither her mother nor her aunt had gone anywhere near that space. She just stood there for a second, trying to make it make sense, then forced herself to keep going because she'd been given a task. She went into the spare bedroom, grabbed the blankets, and started back. As she stepped out into the hallway again, she looked up without thinking, like her eyes were pulled there. That was when she saw a figure leaning over the square opening, looking straight down at her. At first glance, it had the shape of a man, but it didn't look human in any normal way. It reminded her of something elf-like, small enough that it didn't fill the opening. It had long hair with a pointed hat sitting on top. The clothes looked tattered, and she remembered them as green, a green that stood out in the dim hallway. The skin was brown, the eyes were black, and the body was short and rounded through the middle instead of thin. In her mind, it was no taller than about 3 feet. It crouched forward, hunched over the edge like it had been waiting for her to come back, and what hit her hardest was the grin. It wasn't neutral or curious, it looked mean, like it was pleased that she was the one who had noticed it. Alex froze with the blankets in her arms. She didn't scream, she didn't move, and she later said she couldn't. The thing spoke to her, and the voice was wrong for its size. It told her to come closer, calling her little girl. It wasn't gentle either, and she remembered it as harsh and threatening, high-pitched but also strangely deep at the same time. It kept repeating itself, telling her to come there and to come up, again and again, like it was ordering her. Alex didn't answer though. She stood there staring up at it while it kept saying the same thing in a way that felt endless. Even if it couldn't have been more than a short moment, fear made it feel stretched out. She knew, even as a kid, that she wasn't looking at a normal person. Nothing about it felt safe, and she had a clear sense that whatever it was, she shouldn't do what it was telling her. At some point, her body finally moved. She turned and ran, not thinking about anything except getting away. As she sprinted down the hall, she could hear it laughing from above. That laugh felt worse than the voice because it sounded pleased, almost triumphed, like it enjoyed watching her panic. She ran back to where her mother and aunt were and blurted out what she had seen. She expected shock, but they dismissed it immediately and told her she was imagining things. Alex insisted though she wasn't, and she kept pleading until they finally agreed to go back down the hallway with her. When they got there, the attic opening was still the same. The closet doors were still open and the board was still shifted so the attic was ajar and the light was still on inside. The figure was gone. That detail mattered to Alex because she wasn't tall enough to reach the opening and she couldn't have turned on a light inside the attic even if she wanted to. Even if the adults wanted to brush off what she claimed to see, the attic being open and lit was right in front of them. After that, the mood changed fast. The packing stopped feeling important and they didn't keep arguing about imagination. They left quickly and Alex remembered the move being abandoned half finished. She remembered her aunt calling her husband's ex and telling him he could come finish clearing the place himself. Alex never claimed she understood what the thing was or why it showed itself then. She only said she never forgot the sight of it leaning over the attic opening with that grin, repeating for her to come closer. The roar over the campsite. One summer, when he was around 15, a boy went away to a scout camp at Bear Lake in Idaho, and the one night from that trip never left him. Years later, he still says, without joking, that he believes he and his buddy saw a dragon, and what makes the memory stick is how ordinary the week felt before that storm had rolled in. For most of the camp, the weather stayed sunny and warm, the kind of steady stretch that makes you forget how quickly things can shift near a big lake. Then, one day, the sky had turned heavy and dark. Clouds piled up until the light looked wrong, and by evening, the air had that storm feeling, like everything was waiting for the first real break. It began as a drizzle during the day, but by night it had turned into a hard, constant downpour, the kind that soaks through everything and makes the whole campsite feel exposed. His troop site was right along the bank of the lake near the south end, so there was nothing between their tents and the open water except darkness, wind, and the sound of rain hitting everything it could. Fast forward, in the middle of the night, he woke up suddenly, not because of a nightmare or shouting, but because he had to use the bathroom badly enough that sleep wasn't even an option anymore. Outside the tent, it was pitch black. The wind was tearing through the campsite with a sharp, howling sound, loud enough that it made the storm feel crowded, like the air itself was yelling. Scouts had a buddy rule, especially at night, and he followed it. He shook his assigned buddy awake and told him he needed to go. The other kid came up groggy and irritated, immediately asking if he was serious and not quietly either. But once he realized it wasn't a joke, he dragged himself out of the sleeping bag, grabbed a jacket and a flashlight, and got moving. They pulled on boots, unzipped the tent, and stepped straight into the rain. The second they were outside, they were drenched. It didn't matter that they had jackets either, because the rain was coming in hard and the wind was throwing it sideways. They started walking toward the outhouse after that, with their flashlights cutting small, weak tunnels through the dark. The campsite looked nothing like it had during the day. The familiar paths had disappeared into black mud, and everything beyond the flashlight beams felt like a blank wall. They had made it about halfway when they heard a roar, sudden and loud enough that it seemed to come from the storm itself. Both of them froze. In that split second, their first thought was a bear, which made sense there, especially in a place literally called Bear Lake. Panic hit fast. They turned, sweeping their flashlights back into the darkness, but the rain and wind swallowed the light. They couldn't see anything solid, just moving sheets of water and shadows. Then lightning flashed, bright enough to wipe out the darkness for a moment, and that was when they saw it. Against the sky was a huge shape, not close enough to show details like skin or color, but clear enough in silhouette that the outline didn't match any animal either of them expected. They described it as having a massive wingspan, a long neck, and a tail that looked spiked. The wings were caught mid-beat, the kind of slow, powerful downstroke you'd expect from something heavy that still somehow stayed in the air. It crossed over them fast, and the storm made the moment feel unreal, like the sky had opened and dropped the shape into view for just long enough to prove it was there. As it passed, the air moved with it. They said the force of the wing beat shoved them, not just a gust of wind that could be blamed on the storm, but a push that knocked them down into the mud as it went overhead. That was the part that turned the fear into something greater, because it felt physical, like being hit by a wave of air. They didn't stay to test what they'd seen though. They ran back toward the tent as fast as they could, slipping in the mud and not caring. Once they reached back, they got inside and stayed there, shaken up and listening to the rain hammering down. The bathroom trip too was forgotten completely until the morning. Even years later, he says the story never turned into a funny camp memory for him. What stayed was the shared agreement between him and the friend who was there, because they both saw the same silhouette in the same flash of lightning, both felt that sudden push of air, and both ran back knowing they weren't going to stand in an open storm and argue with their own instincts. They still talk about it now, and as far as they're concerned, they didn't just hear something in the night. They saw it, and in their minds, there's only one name that fits what passed over them in that lightning-lit sky. What looked like a unicorn? When he was around 11 or 12, a boy living out in the rural hills and woods of western Pennsylvania had an experience he still talked about decades later. He was outside in broad daylight, sitting in his sandbox, when he was suddenly hit with a strong sense that something was watching him. It wasn't full panic, but it was intense enough to make him stop and scan the area the way kids do when their instincts tell them something is wrong. At first, he expected a normal explanation. In that area, it could have been a black bear, a mountain lion, a coyote, or even a stray dog. He stood up, listened for movement, and watched the tree line for anything shifting in the brush. Nothing showed itself right away though. The yard looked normal, the woods were quiet, and he started to settle a little, though the uneasy feeling didn't fully leave. He decided to walk around the property anyway, checking just in case there really was something out there. That was when he saw it, and the first thing that grabbed him was the color. It was pure white, bright enough to stand out sharply against the greens and browns of summertime foliage. From a distance, the animal's build reminded him of a white-tailed deer. The body shape, legs, and overall size seemed deer-like, no larger than a deer, and it moved with the same calm, cautious manner he was used to seeing in local wildlife. His mind went to the most reasonable answer he could come up with, that maybe it was an albino deer. He moved closer to the front yard to get a better look, careful not to startle it. He later estimated it was roughly 100 to 150 yards away, close enough to make out details that didn't fit. The biggest one was the tail. He knew what a white-tailed tail should look like, and this wasn't it. This tail looked long, about 3 feet by his estimate, and thin like a whip or vine. The comparison that immediately came to him was a lion's tail, except there was no tuft at the end. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a strange deer and started feeling like something he couldn't place at all. The whiteness seemed consistent across the entire animal. The body, legs, neck, tail, even the hooves looked solid, bright white. It stood out in the open, and at first its head was down like it was grazing or sniffing the ground. He could watch its movements clearly, but the one thing he couldn't properly make out was the head and face. When he tried to focus on it, it was as if his eyes wouldn't resolve the details. He described it as a smeary, hazy blur, like a veil hiding the features, even though the rest of the animal stayed clear. He stood still and watched regardless, wanting to take in as much as possible without spooking it. Eventually, the animal had noticed him. He expected that once it lifted its head and looked at him, he'd finally be able to tell what it was. Instead, the same problem remained. He could see darker areas where the eyes should be, and he thought he could make out the general shape of a muzzle. The best he could say was that it seemed wider and more squared off than a deer's, almost cow-like, but he couldn't be sure because the blur covered the exact details he needed. He also noticed the tail moving while it watched him, lifting, curling, and flicking in a way that brought him back to that lion tail comparison. For a stretch of time, they simply watched each other. He stayed completely still, partly because he didn't want it to bolt, and partly because he couldn't get past the frustration of not being able to see its face. After a while, the animal relaxed, lowered its head again like it wasn't bothered by him, and then walked calmly into thicker foliage leading into the woods. It didn't run though, and instead it moved off steadily, almost like it had decided the encounter was over. The moment it disappeared, he ran inside and told his mother. He said he thought he had seen a unicorn, but she didn't take him seriously. Later, he told the landlord's wife, a Cherokee woman he described as a respected medicine woman. He explained everything: the sudden feeling of being watched, the animal's impossible whiteness, the deer-like body, the long whip-like tail, and the way the head and face stayed blurred no matter how hard he tried to focus. She listened without interrupting, then asked him what he believed he saw. When he said he thought it was a unicorn, she told him that if that was what he believed, then that was what it was. When he questioned though how something like that could appear there, she explained that spirits and mystical animals weren't bound by ordinary rules or geography, and that they could appear where they chose and be seen only if they allowed it. As he got older, he tried to make sense of it by reading about unicorn descriptions. At some point, he came across the Qilin, sometimes described as a Chinese unicorn, and he felt the description matched his memory closely enough to stand out. The detail he kept circling back to was the head and face, and he developed his own theory for why he couldn't see it clearly. He believed the animal hid that part on purpose, using what he called glamour, a concealment meant to prevent a clear identification. Even after all those years, he emphasized a few things he felt sure about. He wasn't sick at the time, wasn't taking medication, and had no history of hallucinations. He was the only witness and never saw the animal again. What stayed with him was how clearly he remembered everything he could see, and how strange it felt that the one part he needed most, the face, stayed just out of reach even in the middle of a bright day. Flying through the night. Although she was Filipina, user Iambeck grew up in California, and for a long time, the Philippines felt like a future plan her parents talked about more than a real home. Her parents wanted to retire there, so they bought a house, and when she was about 6 or 7, she ended up living in the Philippines for a few years, starting in 1998. English was her first language, and she could understand some Tagalog, but she couldn't really speak it, which made her depend heavily on the adults around her. Because of that, the house had a steady rotation of live-in help. She remembered having a lot of nannies, and each one came with stories, which was part of how she developed a taste for scary topics. She believed in ghosts, and she used to assume folklore creatures were just stories adults told kids. Eventually, her parents hired a nanny named Joanne who felt like the perfect fit, someone she later compared to a Mary Poppins. After Joanne, her parents focused on hiring housekeepers for cooking and cleaning, and some didn't last because they were lazy, some stole, and some were simply unsettling to be around. 2 housekeepers though, Lita and Helen, stood out the most. They were older women from a remote mountain province. poverty sounded severe where they came from, and the way they described home made it feel isolated, with nipa huts and jungle-like surroundings, no city nearby, and gas lamps and candles used at night. She never described them as evil, just as people who carried a different worldview shaped by hard living and old fears. They were also the ones who told her stories about creatures from Filipino folklore. By then, her father had built their house in a new subdivision with only a few homes, so the area still felt underdeveloped, surrounded by trees and open fields. Lita talked about a creature known by different names, including the aswang and the kikik. She described it as something that flew at night and hunted, usually targeting pregnant women and children. She also insisted there were rules, and she tried to reassure the child by saying these creatures liked open areas and lots of trees, but couldn't easily get into houses made of cement and steel. In the middle of 2000, her parents left for their annual 2-month trip back to California to visit her older sister. She stayed in the Philippines though because she had school, which meant she was in the house with Joanne, Lita, and Helen. One night, she remembered standing by the front window looking out at the moon while Joanne commented on how calm the night felt. Not long after that, shouting erupted from the back of the house near the large kitchen. When she went toward the noise, she found Helen bracing herself against the door, struggling to keep it shut as a strong wind pushed and rattled it. At the same time, Lita was nearby holding a machete up and yelling toward the trees behind the yard. What stuck with her was how suddenly the backyard had changed. The front of the house had felt still, but now the trees in the back were swaying violently, like a storm had arrived out of nowhere. As she got closer, she could catch pieces of what Lita was shouting, ordering something to go away, insisting there was no child there, and saying she wasn't afraid. Lita threatened that if it came closer, she would use the machete, even saying she would cut its tongue off, and the way she said it sounded like she was responding to something specific rather than yelling randomly into the dark. Helen noticed the child watching and immediately tried to move her away. She told Joanne to take her inside, keep her away from the windows, cover her with a blanket, and not leave her alone. For a moment, she still tried to look out from the living room window and noticed something that made it feel even stranger. The front yard still looked calm, while the backyard stayed chaotic, almost like the wind was trapped behind the house. Joanne pulled her away though, and she ended up under a blanket on the couch, listening to the shouting continue until it finally stopped. Afterward, Lita and Helen went around the house checking doors and windows, making sure everything was closed and locked, as if they were sealing the place after something came too close. After that night, she said she started hearing a sound outside that she couldn't forget. It was bird-like, repeating key, key, key. She'd heard bats around their mango tree before, but she insisted this was different, louder and harsher. Lita told her it was the sound of a kikik or aswang, and warned her that hearing it far away didn't mean it was far at all. Lita claimed it could be circling the roof or perched above the house while still sounding distant. One night, Lita told her to sleep far from the window. Their home had 2 stories with the bedrooms upstairs, and she usually slept in her parents' room, which had large windows on both sides of the bed. That night, she slept with Joanne on the floor at the foot of the bed instead. She remembered lying awake, still hearing the key, key, key somewhere outside, when she suddenly heard scratching directly above them. She described it like something clawing at wood, except heavier and more forceful than a rat or a cat. When she tried to speak, the scratching intensified and became more frantic, which made her feel like whatever was up there reacted to her voice. Joanne hushed her and told her to stay quiet, and the fear built until she cried herself to sleep. When her parents returned from California, she told them everything. They didn't believe it though and were upset about the stories and fear she'd been exposed to, so they dismissed Lita and Helen, replaced them with younger housekeepers, and told Joanne not to mention folklore creatures or scary topics again because she had become too afraid to be alone. What stayed in her mind was that something strange was still reported even after Lita and Helen were gone by someone who hadn't been involved before. A new housekeeper named Rosalinda often woke up around 4 or 5 in the morning to hang laundry while it was still dark. She overheard Rosalinda telling Joanne that she once saw a huge bird perched outside the child's window, facing the glass as if it were looking into the room. Rosalinda said that when it noticed her, it turned toward her and flew away, and she claimed its eyes looked like they were glowing yellow. Seeing a hellhound twice. A 41-year-old man from Louisiana described an experience in the woods that disturbed him partly because he felt he had no reason to exaggerate it. He said he'd been born and raised in the state, spent most of his life outdoors, and grew up hunting, fishing, and paying attention to wildlife. He also emphasized that he knew what sleep deprivation and heavy drug use could do to a person's perception because he'd been around it firsthand in the past, and he wasn't interested in being talked into the idea that he simply misidentified something. In his mind, the point was simple. He knew what he saw, and he knew how strange it sounded. The setting was the thick, untouched woods behind his neighborhood, a place he treated as familiar ground. He was deer hunting there, and around midday, as he was heading out, he noticed what looked like a massive dog standing roughly 30 feet away. The animal had short, scruffy hair that looked jet black. He couldn't make out the eyes clearly, but he was certain they weren't glowing or oddly lit. They looked normal, at least from what he could tell in that moment. What stood out wasn't anything theatrical. It was the size, the stillness, and the way it held its focus on him. He then spoke to it like he would any unexpected animal, asking what it was doing back there. Then he tried to push it off the way some hunters might chase off a stray dog. He jumped toward it, expecting it to bolt, but it didn't react the way he expected. It just kept staring at him. That refusal to flinch is what made him change tactics. He ran forward about 10 feet, trying to force the animal to commit to a direction so he could track where it went. Instead, in the span it took him to look for movement, it was simply gone. At first, he filed it away as a strange encounter with a large dog that had slipped off into the brush. But 2 days later, on Monday morning around 7:30 a.m., he was back in the same general area looking for a deer he might have hit. He described it as close enough to the first location that the distance felt meaningful, around 30 to 40 yards apart if you measured straight across. Both areas sat near the edge of a narrow swamp, and both times he placed the animal about 20 feet from the swamp line. The second time, the animal appeared on the opposite side of the swamp, which was why he measured the distance as quoted as the crow flies, not by walking it. When he turned and saw it again, it hit differently. There wasn't as much brush around the animal this time, which made the view feel clearer. He asked it out loud if it was after his deer. Then, because he was carrying a crossbow, he lifted his scope and looked at it through that. He said he got a good look and still came away with the same impression, that it looked like a huge dog. Nothing about it was cartoonish or obviously unnatural in its features, and he made a point of saying he loves dogs and wouldn't shoot one. But even with that calmer, closer look, the movement kept its edge because of how the animal behaved. It didn't make noise, and it didn't move around or pace. It just stared, never blinking in a way he could notice, and he never saw it walking or turning. When he lowered the crossbow again, it was gone, and he couldn't make that disappearance line up with the terrain. With the sun out and the brush thinner, he didn't see how an animal that large could have run off without him catching sign of it. That second disappearance was the moment he said his thinking shifted. The first sighting could be brushed off as a big stray dog slipping into thick cover. The second, in clearer conditions, made him feel like he had watched something vanish without the usual signs of movement. He also noted that he didn't have his phone on him either time. He said he avoids bringing it into the woods because of an issue with the ringer volume that he can't easily adjust, so he leaves it at home. After the second sighting, he regretted that decision because the first thing he did afterward was search online for similar reports. He said he planned to start bringing his phone from that point on and would share any future sightings or photos if he got them. When he described the animal's size, he kept it practical. He estimated it stood around 4 to 5 feet at the top of the head while on all fours. It didn't show any obvious deformities or features he could point to as proof of something supernatural either. The only strange thing in his telling was how huge it was and how silently it appeared and disappeared. He also stressed that the animal never made a sound in either encounter and the staring was consistent both times. He framed the whole thing as frustrating more than anything because it made him feel like he'd stepped into a kind of story he used to read with skepticism. He said he had always been fascinated by mysterious creatures, but he didn't truly believe in them before. Strange puppy in the backyard. Sometime around 2016, a strange moment in one neighborhood made someone question whether what they saw outside was even a normal dog at all. Their area was the kind of place where it wasn't unusual to see pets wandering around, especially because one nearby household kept several small breeds and a few bigger ones. With that being so normal, the thing that happened one late evening stood out even more. That night, the person was inside with their sister and the sister's children, all of them sitting in the living room watching a movie. At some point, they remembered the laundry hanging outside and decided to quickly bring it in. They were in a hurry because they didn't want to miss any scenes, so they stepped out into the backyard with a kind of rushed focus people have when they're trying to do one quick task and get back inside. The yard wasn't completely dark either. There was a yellow light on a post that lit up the area, partly for visibility and partly because people sometimes passed behind the property and the light helped prevent anyone from tripping in the dark. While gathering clothes off the line, the person looked toward the back and noticed what looked like a chihuahua standing in the yard of the house behind theirs, near the only home positioned at the back. It looked like it was right in front of that neighbor's place, stiff and unmoving. At first, the sight didn't seem impossible, but the longer they stared, the more wrong it felt. The dog wasn't shifting its weight or wandering around the way a small dog usually would. It was just planted there, rigid, with its eyes wide open and its ears held stiff. The expression is what disturbed them most. In the dimmer part of that small backyard, around 11 p.m., it looked like it was, quote, smiling, a detail that stuck because it felt so unnatural in that lighting and at that hour. Because their older sister had worked at the neighbor's eatery and knew the pets well, they called out to her right away. They were still staring at the animal about 10 to 12 feet away and shouted something like, "Tay, Bruno is outside. I think he escaped from the cage." The assumption was simple. If it really was Bruno the Chihuahua, the sister would recognize it, and maybe the dog would respond to her voice. For a second, the person glanced toward where their sister was because there was no immediate response. When they looked back, however, the Chihuahua was gone. It hadn't trotted off or run across the yard where they could track it. It was just not there anymore, like it had dropped out of sight in the moment their eyes left it. Almost at the same time, they got movement in their peripheral vision closer to their own house. Something shifted and seemed to tuck itself behind a bamboo stick that had been placed near the fireplace area. What they saw next was not a dog's paw. They described seeing what looked like the foot of a goat, black and small, in a spot where it made no sense. The detail that made it feel even more disturbing was how tiny it looked compared to the bamboo, as if it could hide behind something that should not have been enough to conceal anything solid. The reaction came fast and without much thought. They suddenly started crying and ran back inside, calling for their sister. Once inside, they explained what happened and insisted their sister check for Bruno outside. The sister did, but she couldn't find the dog anywhere. She also pointed out that it didn't add up. According to her, the neighbor's routine was strict. When the eatery closed in the afternoon, all of the pets were brought inside, and at night they were kept secured in cages. She also said it would have been nearly impossible for that chihuahua to end up behind the houses because the back portion had already been closed off and walled in. Hearing that only made the person feel worse about what they had just seen because it meant the simplest explanation didn't fit. That was when an older rumor snapped back into their mind, one they'd heard before but never fully took seriously. People in the area had talked about a creature called a sigbin, something said to appear at night and sometimes resemble a small animal. In the version they remembered, it was described as goat-like and connected to stories about lurking in the dark and frightening people. They also remembered a separate incident that was treated like a local warning story where an uncle was drinking late at night with friends and went out to pee near a well, then came back with a nervous look and claimed he had seen a sigbin. His friends laughed at him afterward, and he supposedly chose to pee somewhere else instead. That memory didn't prove anything, but it made the night feel heavier in hindsight. The thing on the path. When they were kids, one person carried around a memory that never fit neatly into anything ordinary, and it only started feeling stranger years later when they tried to explain it out loud and realized how little sense it still made. Their grandmother owned a small section of woods, the kind families visit in summer because it feels private and familiar. The adults would settle in with drinks and snacks, talking for hours, while the kids were free to roam and make their own entertainment. The whole area was a mix of thin patches of woodland broken up by farmland, so you could be in trees one minute and looking out over open fields the next. On the day it happened, the person was walking with cousins along a dirt path that ran between two different worlds. On one side was the edge of the woods and on the other was open farmland. The woods beside the path didn't belong to their grandmother, and the kids knew that, so they stayed out of it. They just walked along the path, talking the way kids do, looking at whatever caught their attention. At one point, they were pointing towards a shed tucked back in the trees, mostly because it reminded them of one their grandmother had. Then the mood flipped without warning. Something suddenly came tearing through the woods toward them, moving fast enough that it didn't feel like a normal animal calmly crossing through. It wasn't walking, it was storming forward, weaving through the trees as it closed the distance, like it had a line on them. The person's best description, even years later, was that it looked like a centaur. The front half seemed large in an almost human way, like the shape and size of a very tall, muscular adult man. Behind that, the body dropped into something shorter and animal-like, closer to a deer than anything else they could compare it to. The proportions were wrong for anything they recognized, and the speed made it harder to dismiss because the woods were full of bushes and undergrowth. In their mind, a person couldn't run through that kind of growth that quickly without getting tangled up or slowed down, and yet this thing was doing it anyway. All of them reacted at the same time. Nobody stood there trying to study it. They panicked and ran straight back to the adults, breathless and talking over each other. The part that stuck with the person too was that it wasn't just one kid telling a wild story. They all described basically the same thing, like they'd watched the same impossible shape moving toward them and their brains had grabbed the closest label they had for it. Some of the older cousins came back with them, thinking maybe they could spot tracks or catch sight of whatever it was, but when they returned to the path, there was nothing there at all. That absence was what made it linger. The wooded areas around there weren't huge forests where something big could disappear for miles. They were thin strips and small patches. There weren't many wild animals in them either, mostly pheasants, hares, and occasionally a small deer. The surrounding farms kept cows and horses, animals the kids had seen plenty of times, and they were sure it hadn't been either of those. The shape didn't match, the height didn't match, and the way it moved didn't match. By the end of it, there was no satisfying explanation waiting for them. Just a short burst of terror, a shared description that didn't fit the local wildlife, and a stretch of path that looked completely normal again once the older kids showed up. And even later, when the person tried to replay it in their head, the same questions stayed stuck in the memory. What could run through thick undergrowth that fast in a shape that looked half human and half deer and then vanish from a small strip of woods without leaving anything behind? Hellhound in the woods. A few years ago, Dylan was riding a four-wheeler through the woods with his dad and brother when he saw something that didn't fit the place around it. It was daylight, they were just moving through the trees like normal, and then this creature had appeared in his view. The way he remembered it, it looked like it was made out of shadow, with thin, skinny legs and glowing red eyes that stood out hard against everything else. He didn't describe it doing anything dramatic, but the feeling it gave him was strong enough that he never forgot it. What struck most was the way it had looked at him. In his mind, it wasn't like an animal glancing up and running off. It felt like it stared straight through him, like it was focused on him in a way that made his stomach drop. After that day, the memory kept coming back at random, and it always came with the same reaction, fear that didn't feel normal or controllable. More recently, Dylan said he started looking things up, trying to find any description that matched what he saw, and he landed on the idea of a hellhound. Once he had that name in his head, it made the memory feel even heavier, like he had finally found a category for it, but it also made him think about it more than he wanted to. He noticed that certain small things started setting him off because they reminded him of the eyes. One night, he had an old-time radio on and it had a red light. The glow from it reflected onto his window in a way that looked like two red points from outside. The second he saw it, his body reacted before his brain could talk him out of it. He froze in place, staring at the window because for a split second it looked too much like those eyes again, and the fear hit him just as hard as it did in the woods. Dylan couldn't shake the thought that the creature might be near his home for a reason. He started wondering if it was guarding something, like it had a purpose for being in the area. What confused him was that he saw it during the day, even though from what he'd read, these kinds of creatures were supposed to come out at night. That mismatch made him loop back into the same questions: why it would be so close to where he lived, why it would be walking around in daylight, and why the memory still felt so sharp years later. At the same time, he admitted he had a strange pull toward it. Part of him wanted to see it again, not from far away, but up close, because he felt like that would prove he wasn't imagining things. Since that sighting, he also felt like he changed in small ways. He said he'd become drawn to the color red, and he noticed how fast he could react without thinking. He gave one example from a dream where he felt a pair of hands touches and his body snapped into motion so quickly that he swung at the air and accidentally hit his dog, even though he wasn't fully awake when it happened. Saved by the shadow dog. Anne, a young adult in Germany, shared a story that she framed as part of something larger, not a single incident tied to one house or one room. She said the experience followed her from place to place, and in her mind it felt less like a random scare and more like being watched. She described it as stalking, with the episode she wrote about standing out as the clearest and most believable moment she'd had so far. She traced the beginning back to when she was around 9 years old. At first, it was smaller things that could be brushed off if you tried hard enough, like hearing growls in the quiet parts of the night when everything else in the house was still. Those sounds alone were disturbing, but she said what really changed the way she understood it was the night she heard a woman's voice. The voice sounded like it was screaming for help, and then almost immediately afterward, there was another growl and then silence, like someone had turned the whole moment off. Even years later, that sequence stayed with her because it felt too specific to be a simple creak in the house or a noise from outside. The fear spiked again when she was 16, during a week when she was already run down. She'd been sick for more than a week, dealing with a headache and an upset stomach, nothing that sounded dramatic, but enough that she felt worn out and off balance. The night she focused on happened around her 16th birthday, close to 11 at night when she was in bed in her room. She heard movement and at first didn't think much of it because she had 2 cats. She expected it to be them shifting around or jumping onto something. Then she heard a growl, and at the same time she noticed her room felt freezing cold in a way that didn't match the rest of the house. That's when she looked up and saw what she described as a black dog in the room with her. The dog was growling, and she said its eyes looked wrong, like dark pits rather than normal eyes. She described the dog lunging toward her after staring her down for a moment, and then just as suddenly it was gone, as if it had vanished into the wall behind her. What struck with her was how physical the cold felt in that moment. She said her sheets were colder than the air around her, like the temperature had dropped right where she was lying. Still shaken up, she turned her attention toward the window to her right. From her 4th-story bedroom, she could see a lamp across the street clearly, and she used that as a reference point for how sharp her view was. Near that same line of sight, she said she saw the shadow of a man outside the window, and it looked like he was aiming a gun straight at her. She emphasized that the shape was clear, not vague, and that it didn't feel like a trick of light she could easily explain away. Before she could even process what she was seeing, she said another shadow appeared, this one shaped like the dog, and it went for the man. She heard him make a sound, then yell, and then the scene dropped back into silence again, as if the whole thing had been swallowed by the night. Forest Encounter. A user by the name of Arctic Piggy, a young adult, described an encounter in the mountains that stayed with them, partly because it didn't fit the normal pattern of seeing wildlife on a hike. Their connection to mountain country started early. As a child, they spent part of nearly every summer in a small mountain village where their grandparents rented a house for 3 months at a time. From about age 5 through 14, they went there regularly with their older sister, who was 7 years ahead of them, and a cousin who was 3 years younger. Those summers left a strong impression, enough that the mountains stopped feeling like a vacation spot and started feeling like a place they were drawn back to. By the time they were 26, that habit had turned into a yearly routine. Every summer, she went hiking with her boyfriend, usually choosing trails that were steep and demanding. Sometimes it was just the 2 of them out there with no other hikers nearby, and the quiet could feel complete once they got high enough. If the climb was long, they sometimes camped halfway to break it up. One day, during a hike near a lake in Italy, they tackled a difficult trail that climbed up to a high point with a clear view. She reached the top first and waited while her boyfriend finished the last stretch. The spot felt calm and alive in a normal way. They described butterflies moving around the flowers nearby and birds making noise in the trees, and from where she sat, she could see the lake below ringed by forest. It was the kind of place where sitting still and watching can feel like the best part of the hike, because everything around you keeps going on without noticing you. While she was sitting on that rock though, that calm shifted. Without hearing anything obvious, she got the strong feeling that something was in the woods behind them. The trail ended at the top, and just past that point, the ground dropped away into a small precipice. It wasn't extremely deep, but it was enough that the forest covered the bottom and made it hard to see clearly into the trees. She stood up and looked down, trying to figure out what had triggered the feeling. That was when she spotted an animal moving in the vegetation below. At first, it looked like a chamois, the kind of mountain animal she rarely saw up close, and that sight excited her. The animal was beautiful in the way wild creatures can be when they appear unexpectedly, with long horns and light brown fur. She noticed a dark stripe running along its back from the neck toward the tail, a detail that helped the identification feel solid for a moment. Then the details stopped matching. As the animal walked slowly and calmly through the plants, she realized its front legs didn't end in normal cloven hooves. Instead, the front feet looked wrong, ending in 3 long fingers. The best comparison she could give was a bird-like claw, though she emphasized it didn't look as sharp as an eagle's talons. The back legs, however, seemed normal, which made the mismatch even stranger, like 2 different sets of limbs on one body. As she stared, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, she noticed something else that disturbed her more than the legs. The animal's face looked flat. It didn't appear to have a muzzle, and the usual shape of a forehead and nose didn't seem to be there at all. She couldn't get a direct, clear look head on before it moved, but she was left with the impression that the front of its head was missing the structure that should have been visible. Looking back, she said the part that bothered her was not seeing it head on, because she kept wondering how the eyes and mouth could possibly be arranged if the face was really as flat as it appeared in that moment. Before she could watch it any longer, the animal slipped into the shadow of the pines and disappeared. She was still standing there, shaken up and trying to replay the sight in her mind when her boyfriend finally reached the top. She told him what she had just seen, but he didn't take it seriously and laughed it off. She understood how it sounded when put into words, almost like something that could be turned into a joke. A chamois with strange front feet and a flat face, but the memory didn't feel funny to her. The rest of the descent was spent turning it over again and again, trying to decide whether it could have been a trick of distance, lighting, or angle. By the time she was heading down, she was already arguing with herself, wondering if her mind had filled in details that weren't really there, or if she had briefly seen something she couldn't explain. She eventually tried to dismiss it as a moment of imagination, even though part of her wanted the opposite, some reassurance that it was real and that someone else had seen the same thing. She also mentioned a practical frustration. There were no villages at the base of the mountain where she could ask locals if anyone had ever noticed an odd animal in that area, or if there were any stories about something unusual living in the forest. With no way to check the sighting against anyone else's experience, the story ended the way it began, with one person left holding a vivid image that didn't fit neatly into anything she recognized, and no clear way to prove to herself what it truly was. A ghost or a Kapre? After a long stretch with nothing unusual really happening, the writer said the next experience didn't come until years later, sometime during college. The exact year felt hard to pin down, but the moment itself stayed clear in memory. By then, the living situation had changed. They weren't staying with an aunt in Angeles City anymore, and the family wasn't living in the subdivision that they used to mention. Instead, they were back in the province, staying in a house with an uncle, a grandmother, and siblings. The area was described as quiet and isolated, the kind of place where going out for basics takes time. The nearest grocery store was around 30 minutes away, and the nearest mall could take about an hour depending on traffic. Their barangay sat near a mountain, and getting to the highway meant a short tricycle ride. Before reaching the more central part of the barangay, most of what you saw were rice fields rather than houses. Their house sat in the middle part of the village. Out front, it faced a basketball court, and at the back, there was a view of rice plains leading toward the mountain. One night, while sleeping, they suddenly felt what seemed like a large hand pressing against their chest and shaking them hard, urgently, like someone trying to wake them up immediately. The first few shakes were especially strange because they couldn't open their eyes right away, almost like their body wasn't responding properly. When they finally managed to open their eyes, though, they sat abruptly, and at that exact moment, the shaking had stopped. The pressure vanished as soon as they were fully awake. Still confused though, they looked around the room, trying to figure out who would have woken them like that. All of their sisters were asleep. Everyone shared the same room, with one foldable bed and a double-deck bed, and they slept on the upper deck. Nothing looked disturbed, and no one was moving. That's part of what made it hard to explain, because the sensation had felt so physical and real only seconds earlier. One detail that stuck was how big the hand had seemed. It didn't feel like an ordinary adult hand, and in their mind it felt huge, like it belonged to something the size of a very tall person, maybe 6 or 7 feet. At first, they tried to write it off as a nightmare, the kind that can feel vivid and leave you pretty terrified. But even after sitting up, they said they could still feel the impression of that hand on their chest for a few minutes, long enough that it didn't fade the way most dream sensations do. Eventually, they fell back asleep, but the lingering feeling had bothered them. That's what led them to wonder if it could have been something else, especially because they had heard stories in their family about a Kapre. They described believing in ghosts more easily because they felt they had experienced hauntings before, but they still had doubts about folklore creatures since they hadn't clearly seen one. Still, the province house had features that older relatives talked about in a serious way. There were mango trees around the home and a large bamboo tree beside the lot, and elders said unseen beings lived in them. They also mentioned a family story tied to that same house. A cousin's half-sister, someone they no longer spoke to, had reportedly seen a Kapre there before. The story came from their grandmother, who said the woman once screamed after looking out a window at night, insisting she saw a pair of pitch-black legs outside. The description matched what people often say about a Kapre being unusually tall, sometimes described as 7 to 9 feet. Even with those stories in mind though, the writer didn't treat the shaking as proof. After waking up, they didn't notice anything else unusual in the room, and nothing in the surroundings felt clearly changed. The experience didn't repeat either. They described it as the first and only time something like that had happened while staying in the province, and they weren't sure whether to label it as a strange sleep event, a ghostly encounter, or something connected to the older warnings about what might be near the trees and the house.